Good, man. I appreciate you taking my call earlier today as soon as the news came out. And you took my call in the middle of your homework and said, yeah, let's go ahead and get something on the calendar. So awesome, awesome. So yeah, if we could just kind of jump into this, I made a commitment to my friends and family that I want to help with a lot of the concerns and anything coming down the pipeline when it comes to news. And I figure if I don't have the answers, let me partner with the right resources to get the right answers out there. So hence Buck Hujabre. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the most recent thing that came out. The Feds just announced that they were going to be slashing their interest rates to zero. So first,
Yeah.
if you can start by kind of telling us a little bit more around what does that mean? What did they exactly do?
Okay. Great question. So what's important about the federal funds rate and when it gets cut is it's extremely important because other rates like domestic, international, um, a multitude of different financial products are directly related to the Fed funds rate and they move in tandem with it. Okay, so why is that important? The Fed funds rate, it's a monetary policy tool. It's used to achieve the Fed's goals of price stability, which for our purposes today, let's call it low inflation and sustainable economic growth. Okay, we'll dive into what that means in just a minute because it's particularly important with everything going on right now around the globe, around the country, right? Changing the federal funds rate is essentially a tool and it influences the money supply beginning with the banks when they borrow the money from the federal government, hence the federal funds rate, and that eventually trickles down through the process to the consumers. It's important to know when the Fed reduces rates, right? When they cut interest rates, it's in directly and proportionately to stimulate economic growth, right? Lower financing costs, money coming from the government that the banks are borrowing and then lend to the consumer. When those rates are lower, when they're cheaper, it actually encourages more borrowing and more investing. But, and here's my caveat, okay? And for those of you that are Keller Williams agents, I said the word but, I understand. There's not an and for this. So Gary Keller's gonna have me just drawn, quartered, and feathered and tarred, okay? When rates are too low, they can actually spur inflation. That's a problem that we'll talk about a little bit later on because I'm not actually concerned about that right now, given the overall macroeconomic picture. But the reason you don't want rates too low for too long is you end up with a condition where you have too much money chasing too few goods. I want you to imagine toilet paper as being our monetary policy, getting everything that's happening right now. For some reason, there was a run on toilet paper, and now Amazon, if they even have it in stock, is taking something that you would essentially pay $1 for, and the market is commanding $10 for that same roll of toilet paper. That's the concept of inflation, and that's why we don't want monetary policy to be too low for too long, right? So on the other hand, though, when there's too much growth, when the economy is moving too fast, the Fed will typically raise interest rates. Now, we've not seen that occur over the last 4 or 5 year economic cycle towards the tail end of our growth. Typically, what happens is the government, the Fed, will raise interest rates to slow down the growth of the economy, and that hasn't really occurred, which is why we're in the unique situation that we're in now, where for the first time in probably 10 years, we're at 0% overnight federal funds rate. Statistically, it's 0.25%, but let's call it zero for the sake of argument.
So then what can we expect as, I guess, a byproduct of this happening today?
Well, if I may, Dan, I'd like to pivot a little bit to
Yeah.
get to that answer, if you're cool with that. So here's the good news. For those of you that are watching this now live and that will be watching this later, I want you to know that we understand you're scared, okay? We understand that there's a lot of stuff happening that most people can't fully get their arms around, and that's okay. The good news is, as much as you keep hearing people in the media or in politics or whatever your particular brand of vodka is say that this is unprecedented, I respectfully disagree with that statement. This is precedented. The exact same situation that you're seeing occur socially and financially right now occurred on September the 11th, 2001. Think about it. Aircraft weren't flying. Cruise ships were harbored. Large gatherings of people in public places were not necessarily happening. They were banned, right? Sound familiar? That's what's occurring right now. The good news is we've experienced this before. Totally different cause, right? Coronavirus is completely different to the events that occurred on September the 11th, but we've been here. We've been to a place where the economy and the public have come to an absolute standstill around the world, right? This is not new. Here's the good news. We weathered it before, we will weather it again. And just like the events of September 11th for the economy, there was an economic downturn that the federal government stepped in and created low interest rates to spur the economy. And you know what? It worked. The economy came back stronger than it had been prior to the events of September 11th, and the recovery window was fairly short and fairly sustained. So with that in mind, it will get better. I promise you it will get better. This is the first step in the right direction towards it getting better. And I've got to commend the federal government for stepping in the way that they have. Now, I have all sorts of objections to the fact that we have such low interest rates now, because that can create a whole different set of problems, especially for those that it doesn't benefit. The interest rates are largely going to affect multinational corporations and wealthy individuals. At the risk of sounding like a bailout, I think that it's time that Main Street got help. The individual got help. But we'll talk about that in a different stage when I'm running for office someday. So what can we expect to see, I think was your question, right, Dan?
Mm-hmm.
So with that background, here's what I'm predicting. Based on what history has shown us, I expect there to be significant slowdown in the economy. We're here in Las Vegas. We are probably going to feel this a lot faster than a lot of other markets because we're tourist driven. As much as we've diversified our economy and as much as we're no longer just a gaming town, just a hospitality town, that's going to be the first sectors that are felt. I'm hearing from a lot of my agents and a lot of people in the community that have found out their spouses that are working in the gaming and casino industry are starting to experience layoffs. So this is not to negate that. It's absolutely happening. Here's the caveat. It doesn't matter what interest rates are if people don't have a job, because you don't qualify for low interest rates if you don't have a way to pay back those interest rates. What I think is going to happen overall is a lot of these businesses, the larger multinational conglomerates that are in Vegas, I think that you're going to see a direct stimulus package paid to these employees in some way, shape, or form. I think the larger effect is going to be some landlords may start to kick the can down the road in terms of rental payments for commercial buildings. I think a lot of the mortgage holding companies are probably starting to consider giving some forbearance. Nothing is official yet, but they may say, hey, your next mortgage payment isn't due until X, right? At least I'm hoping that's what happens. Here's the flip side of that. We're also going to see, we're already experiencing it, a micro boom in refinancing. Interest rates are crazy, crazy low. So I think that you're going to see a backlog with the mortgage industry in terms of people applying for new lower interest rates, especially because they have an employment history that qualifies them for that. Now, if we start to see larger layoffs, that's a different issue altogether. But again, because it's getting cheaper to have that money for goods, durable services, what have you, I think it's actually going to create a little microcosm of a safety net. So what does that mean? Earlier today, Dan, you and I spoke about the fact that the last time that this happened was roughly 10 years ago, after the boom-bust cycle in the last economic session, right? So when they had low interest rates, the goal was for businesses to go out and buy more durable goods. Let's say that you're a company that does plumbing, okay? Excuse me. And you've got trucks that you bought the last time around with the lower interest rate money. Well, those trucks have probably come close to the end of their working lives, their useful lives. So with lower interest rates, it spurs that company to go buy new pickup trucks and new equipment and new expensive materials because it's cheaper to buy them as a result of having lower interest rates. And now that salesman that sold the truck collects a commission, and he's probably going to go and eat dinner at a local restaurant, which keeps that economic cycle flowing, all because of a low monetary policy. Do I expect there to be a larger slowdown? Absolutely. How does that affect housing? I think it's a blip. I don't think you're going to see a massive change because here's the other deal. As of last week, we had 4,200 units for sale in Las Vegas. That is an extremely low number. Let's say that we hit the brakes and we double that number of inventory to 8,000 units. That's still inside a balanced market. We're so critically short on inventory that if we were to double the number of units, it's actually not the end of the world. Right. What's that?
We still wouldn't have enough. Yep.
Yeah, so we still wouldn't have enough inventory to service demand. I mean, right? So couple that with low interest rates, people are able to buy more. Those that have jobs and will keep their jobs. And trust me, I'm not suggesting that there's going to be mass quantity layoffs. I think anything but that. I think they're going to start to slow down the hiring and maybe reduce some staff. But here's the deal. Every one of these conventions, every one of these concerts, you name it. They've not said canceled, they've said postponed. So I think these companies are thinking they need to have a tremendous amount of staff for when all that stuff happens again, because it's looking like August, September, and October, a traditionally slow period for Vegas, is going to be the busiest on record.
That's when things will likely come back to normal a little bit.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but predicting what the cycle of this is and what the fallout, the sort of, imagine you drop a pebble into a pond, right? There's that big splash and then it ripples out. We don't really know what that effect is going to look like. We have September 11th, we have the great meltdown, great recession that happened. We have the dot-com boom bust cycle in terms of what that contagion effect looks like, pardon the pun being that this is a virus. So it's difficult for us to measure, but I honestly think that the cycle of this virus and the slowdown of the economy, we should see the end of it by August. Now, I want to make this caveat. We haven't factored the oil war into this yet, and my belief is the larger ramification of the stock market drop is not the coronavirus, it's the oil war that's happening between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Russia, right? And we'll get into that a little bit later on.
So if I'm hearing you right, just kind of pausing and recapping, it's almost like the Fed's decision is telling us that the writing on the wall is that coronavirus has made significant impact to the economy with more to come.
I would do a yes and, to quote our bold law there. I would do a yes and with that. I think it's a preemptive measure. I think that they're looking to stymie whatever this recessionary correction pressure is in the economy. Now, you and I have talked about this at length in terms of my opinion of the recession and if and when and how it comes. And we'll get into that a little bit later if we have time. This, to me, is a calculated countermeasure to help prop up the economy in the event that it wants to have a more significant correction, if that makes sense. Now here's the issue that I have with it. We've got nowhere left to go. So if there is a significant economic effect, they're at zero, right?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And so then I guess the other part of it that you're mentioning is this, although this is substantial, it really doesn't do much if people don't have jobs, which is what we're starting to see to some extent here locally in Vegas, right?
Yeah, if I said to you, hey, Dan, you can go buy that new $45,000 pickup truck for 0% for 60 months. You're thrilled, right? I don't have a job. Yeah. I can't afford it. I don't care how cheap the interest is. The interest doesn't matter to me if I don't have a way to pay for it. And the whole concept behind this, the reduction of overnight Fed funds rate and what they're doing here is so that it creates employment opportunity through demand because of low interest rates to spur on the businesses to keep borrowing and keep entertaining clients out to fancy dinners and travel and what have you.
Okay, so we're kind of answering the next question that I had for us, which was what was going to be its impact on the economy. It's hopefully going to encourage businesses and workers to pump money into the economy, right? And ideally, that's what we'll see. I think the bigger question for particularly the audience that's probably watching this is what does it mean for housing? And so you started to kind of answer that question a little bit. I think the first thing that we need to clarify is this doesn't mean that mortgage interest rates are necessarily going to be cut, right? It's not a direct correlation. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Dan. So mortgage interest rates are more directly related to the 10-year treasury, right? And so 10-year treasury yields, however, everybody flocked to them with the stock market correction. And when there is too much money chasing too few goods, it reduces the treasury yield, right? So we have an issue now where I think mortgage interest rates are actually going to get insanely low. The trick, though, was the warehouses didn't have enough liquidity to meet the demand for the sudden refinances when all that fell over. So they actually raised their rates to kind of be like, hey, everybody, take a breath. Just take a breath. Go to the box. 5 minutes for fighting. Let us sort this out, and then we'll get back to you, right? So I think that you're going to see cheap interest rates for a while, which is hilarious to me because my wife and I, when we got married, we bought our first place together, and the mortgage interest rate was 6.375, and we were jumping for joy. We were like, oh my God, this is so low. This has never happened. My parents bought their first house at 13% interest, right? So to look at that and go, gosh, I never think interest rates will be this low again, and now they're sub 3% in many cases. It's like, right? So here's where the correlation is, the long-winded answer to your very short-winded question. What's it mean for housing? Well, here's the big misnomer. okay? And if you take nothing, gentle viewer, if you take nothing else from this video, then this statement, I will have considered this whole thing a success. Recessions typically have little to no effect on housing prices. Let me say that again. I'm going to reverse it. Recessions typically have little to no effect on housing prices. Now, I see you spitting your coffee out and throwing your stuff and saying, hey, Buck, you're crazy. What happened the last time, right? Here's the deal. Go back and look at recessions through history. I'm 43 years old. I've experienced a few of these. I grew up in Louisiana, an oil and gas country. I lived through the oil and gas cycle, the boom and bust cycle, right? I was a little kid. I remember that we were playing football at one of my birthdays, and the oil prices had done what they're doing right now. And we said, okay, the first touchdown is our driveway. The other touchdown is the for sale sign. And I'll never forget, one of the kids said, which for sale sign, right? That's how bad it was. Every house had a for sale sign on it, right? So I digress. Typically speaking, when interest rates are low, demand for housing goes up. There are more millionaires created in recessions through real estate than at any other time in an economic cycle. So you now have really low interest, so it's really cheap to take the debt to buy a home, and fairly affordable housing with low inventory levels, right? So I think, if anything, those that can and still have a need to buy will. Typically, historically, housing prices tend to stabilize, rents go up during a recession, and then you'll see the recovery process carry those up even higher. It's a perfect storm. Cheap debt to buy a house. You can move up for virtually no money, right? And if you're selling the house that you're in, it'll typically, especially if it's under 350,000, it's sold before you can put it in the MLS, right? So even if all that slows down and goes to stasis, I don't really see much of a change, because you got to live somewhere, right? And having a mortgage is going to be way cheaper than renting, because your mortgage doesn't go up by 3% every year like your rent does.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, right? I think that's a conversation that we've probably been having with real estate agents and consumers for the last, I would say, maybe 9 up to 12 months, right? When that word recession started getting tossed around and fear sets in, right? People are relating that idea to what happened in 2008 and the fact that it was directly correlated to housing. So thank you for kind of correcting that mindset, right? That although the writing's on the wall for us approaching that this time around, it's different. It's different. Thank you. You know, I have a question here from one of the people, one of my friends that is actually watching the video. You know, what does this mean for refinancing? And so you had mentioned that refi rates. I mean, last week actually, if I may, it was crazy with interest rates, right? It was an all-time low, then out of nowhere, right away, it just started jumping up a point, then another point. And so what you're saying is you could see that overall interest rates will likely stay low for the I don't want to say long term, but for a while, and thus maybe we'll see it come back down to what we were seeing earlier in the week.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. You have this temporary bump in rates because the mortgage companies couldn't service them fast enough, right? That's the only reason why they did it. Remember, they control the spread from where they borrow it to where they sell it to the consumer. That's their margin, right? That's their cost of doing business and their profit. So if they get overwhelmed, what's the first thing that you do, right? You raise the prices of it. I mean, again, I'll go back to the toilet paper analogy. There wasn't enough of it, so they raised prices, right? The same concept here. So refis are going to be really attractive. I think refis already are really attractive, but they're going to get even more attractive. And that couples with the fact that if you're looking to move up, this is the best time in history to do it because the money's so cheap. Again, don't put yourself into a situation where you're borrowing when you can't pay it back. That's a terrible idea. And I would talk you out of it, and 190 of my agents would talk you out of it, right? And anybody who doesn't is trying to sell you something versus give you good advice, which is our job, right? To protect and promote your fiduciary, or your fiduciary to protect and promote best interest. But with money this cheap, it doesn't make any sense not to lock your rent in for the next 30 years.
Beautifully put. Okay, so stay in dialogue, right? I guess is what you're saying to that consumer is stay in dialogue and continue to monitor interest rates because it's going to stay low, if not get a little bit lower once they catch up with the demand.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Now,
and here's the thing, the pivot to that too is that they won't raise them for the foreseeable future. Remember what we talked about earlier, you know, when there's too much growth, the Fed raises interest rates, right? They just slow down the growth. Well, if they're even worried that we're tipping over into a correcting market, into a shifting market, they don't really have any incentive to raise rates until we're inside the next recovery cycle, right? So these are going to stay low for a while.
Okay, perfect. So let's switch a little bit, because in the same story, the Fed also announced that they were going to be restarting quantitative easing. What is that?
Yeah. So QE, quantitative easing. So what is it? Well, it's an unconventional monetary policy. I want to start there. This is not typical. I can give you 100 different things. Lowering interest rates.
Remember, keep it low level, right?
What's that?
Yeah, keep it low level for us so we can understand.
Yeah, so perfect. So when you lower interest rates, that's a conventional monetary policy. QE, quantitative easing, is unconventional. And it's when the central bank, right, of the US purchases government securities or securities from the market and increase the money supply. So what does that mean? Well, the purpose of that is to encourage lending and investment, right? When short-term interest rates are approaching zero, right, normal open market operations, which target a return interest rate, they're no longer effective. They don't work. So these two things that have happened today go hand in hand. We're essentially at statistical zero, so it doesn't work, right? So what do they have to do? The government has to step in, the central bank has to step in and target a specific amount of assets to purchase. QE, quantitative easing, increases the money supply. Okay, that increases how much. Imagine a big, gigantic room, and they're just filling it with money by purchasing assets on the open market with a newly created bank reserve to provide banks with that big, full room of cash. Does that make sense?
Why would they do this? I guess that would lead to the no.
So that's a great question. Why would they do this? To keep the spigot flowing, to keep the money flowing, right? The purpose of this is you want to increase the domestic money supply. You want to increase liquidity, right? So it usually, typically, historically, they may do something different this time, although I highly doubt it. The Federal Reserve will purchase government treasuries, right, and other government-backed securities. So let's think about that. They're buying bonds, government bonds, right? They would probably be buying, I would imagine, a lot of mortgage-backed securities. Based on what I'm seeing economically right now, I would imagine that number is somewhere between 150 million and, let's say, 250 million of mortgage-backed securities. So Dan, I'll have you research that, find out how close I am to being accurate on that. Let me know on Tuesday. If I'm wrong, I'll buy you a steak dinner. I've gotten pretty good at this over the years. I would imagine that in this particular condition, that our government's probably going to buy between 400 and call it 500 billion worth of other types of bonds, right? So the reason they do this, right, is to keep money liquid and make sure that they've got the money that's pledged, bank repo market, bond purchase market, to make sure that money keeps flowing. Because when it's this cheap, there's really no incentive for local banks to lend out because they're not making it, right? The drawback to this, of course, we come back to that inflation word, right? In a worst case scenario, the central bank might actually cause inflation because you've got too much money, that quantitative easing money, chasing too few goods.
Wow. Okay, so this is all about just pumping money, keep the money flowing.
It's pumping money, and here's the other issue. One of the risks that you run is it can actually devalue domestic currency, right? So the dollar could fall in value. Many of you, I know you're too young to remember this, you're a child, but a lot of people are too young to remember when the last time they had a significant amount of QE happen. OPEC, the oil producing consortium, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, those places, they seriously looked at pricing oil instead of dollars per barrel in euros per barrel, because the American dollar was beginning to get so devalued. So this is a risk of this, right? It's a very, very delicate dance.
Okay, so then let's kind of wrap both of these conversations up with a bow and then kind of revisit something that you were kind of foreshadowing, maybe we could dig into, which is that oil war conversation. So the Fed, with the slashing of the interest rates to zero, the quantitative easing, if first of all, I'm somebody that might have goals of buying or selling a home, what should I be thinking and feeling right now as a result of today's news?
Well, so here's the thing. It all boils down to, I call it the noise around the peripheral goal, okay? I think you might have just helped me find the title of my book, The Noise Around the Peripheral Goal. You have to ask yourself two questions. Done deal. You have to ask yourself two questions. The first one is, why am I doing this? What's my motivation behind buying or selling a home, right? The second one is, how long do I plan to be in that home, realistically? Now, if you're a military family and you have moving orders every couple of years, obviously that goal can change. If you are a newly minted doctor, nurse, or medical professional and tend to move quickly, that goal can change. But if you boil it down to those two questions, it doesn't really matter what the economy is doing. Honest to God, it really doesn't. You're going to need a place to live. If this is a primary residence, right? You're going to absolutely have a place to live. You might as well take advantage of the lower interest rates. So if the two answers are, I plan to stay in the home 5 years, hopefully 7 years, it's probably a pretty good time to buy regardless of what the market is doing, right? And the second part of that is, if your motivation is just because, I'm tired of the way that my house looks, probably not strong enough motivation. If your family is growing, if you're relocating for a job, or if you just need a change, right? Like a change in terms of not enough space, it would be cheaper to buy new than completely gut and renovate to your taste. Those are strong enough reasons to do it. It ultimately, regardless of interest rates, regardless of the market, real estate always happens, right? That's the thing. Our firm, personally speaking, I'm going to pat myself on the back, we've always done better in a correction than when the market is high, right? Because those are the motivated buyers and sellers, and they have the best reasons in the world for doing it. So the short answer, it doesn't matter what the economy is doing if you have a bona fide and genuine need to be doing it.
I think you just kind of answered the follow-up question is, which if I'm a professional, then how do I have this conversation with my clients and prospects, right? And I think it boils down to, what is your motivation? What is your situation? And I think that latter part, we haven't done a great job as professionals of digging into enough with our consumers. But as a result of what we're dealing with in the world right now, we have to be digging into people's situation, right? And understanding, what are you doing for work? Is it at risk, right?
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, our job, as cool as it is to show fancy property and get to take people down that road of their dreams and hopes and everything they've envisioned, the basis point of our job is that we're fiduciaries. Our job is to protect and promote your best financial interest. As real estate professionals, whether you're on the brokerage side or the mortgage side or the insurance side, we're net worth creators through wealth and real estate, right? That's our one thing. We're creating net worth for the individual American. What more noble cause could there be, right? In terms of helping somebody grow their nest egg. So now's the perfect time as a professional to really dig in with your sphere of influence and grow your sphere of influence when you're looking out for their best interest first and a sale last, right? We want to make sure that and look, you should be on the phone with your database right now. Hey, are you scared? Because I am too. Let me tell you something that's a little less scary when you look at it in perspective. The market in the country has lived through this once through September 11th. There is your precedent. Now let's look at where the market went 9 months after everything came to a halt. Again, it's the perfect example. Cruise ships didn't leave port. People didn't travel. Conventions were canceled. Nobody got together in large groups. Is this sounding familiar? So there's your precedent, right?
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Buck, for that information, man. I saw the news. I figured a lot of people are going to want to interpret this a certain way or create interpretation in our industry. And I'm so glad that you're kind of recentering us almost and saying, listen, this is all noise. And in fact, there's a lot of noise going on. Drown out the noise and let's get back to what's going on with you and what are you looking to achieve, right? So I appreciate you doing that a lot. I think let's bring up this conversation because I have a little bit of time. You still good?
I'm good, yeah.
Okay. You're bringing up the oil war and you're saying that's probably going to have a bigger impact than the conversations we're having around coronavirus. Tell me more.
Okay, so here's the deal. For those of you that didn't have the luxury of growing up in the deep South, like I said, I turned 43 this year. I was a child and I've watched the oil and gas boom bust cycle. Just about everybody I grew up with was involved in oil and gas in some way, shape, or form, right? So I've always kept an eye on it. Now, markets like Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, any of that refinery coast, they feel this a lot, right? So to start at the top, when we drop below, call it $35 a barrel, I haven't done the research in the last few days, the United States doesn't really have the capacity to show a profit in oil production at that point. Now, there's a bunch of different things that go into that, right? But the idea being that with this sort of battle that's happening with OPEC and Russia right now, that they're basically increasing output, more supply, right, for less and less demand, it makes it harder for us to turn a profit. So we start capping wells, and that's when layoffs start to happen. And those are very highly paid, highly skilled individuals. In fact, a lot of the brave men and women of the United States military, because of the skill set that they get, end up going to work in that industry. So I have a double whammy effect with that when I look at it, right? So here's the larger ramification. The stock market correction that we've experienced over the last 2 weeks and the price of oil dropping are the single greatest thing to happen to the consumer. I know that's counterintuitive to what I just told you about oil prices being low, but here's the deal. Over the summer, you're probably not going to pay much more over $2 a gallon aggregate around the country to get your car. Who wouldn't love $2 a barrel or $2 a gallon, right? The second part of that is you now have these bigger companies that have experienced massive devaluation because of the stock market correction that have incentive to get you to spend money. Oh, wait, there's more. They just got short-term interest rates, which means that they can improve their infrastructure, which gives the consumer more choice, which means that the consumer has more voting power with what they're buying, why they're buying it, how they're buying it, and when they're buying it. So while people are freaking out and losing their minds, I'm looking at this as the single greatest consumer opportunity in history, right? This is going to be phenomenal for you, the consumer. And guess what happens when gas prices are low? Hey, instead of flying to Las Vegas for the weekend or San Diego for the weekend, let's drive. Let's make a road trip out of it, and let's stop at all the littered diners, dive-ins, and drives along the way, which helps those small businesses keep money in circulation. By the time they get to Vegas, the demand is back, and now they're lubricating our economy with cheaper money that they didn't even realize they had access to. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It almost feels like this is coming at a cost, though.
It does. I don't want to make it all rosy, right? Because it's not. There are people that are genuinely scared right now, and it's okay to be scared. I mean, if you just got notice that you're performing in a Cirque du Soleil show, right, in Vegas here. I have a lot of friends in Cirque du Soleil, and they're dark, right? If you're a teacher and, you know, the governor just closed schools through, what is it, April the 6th. If you are, you know, any of the a casino dealer, a bartender, any of these people that depend on tips, and there's nobody in the casinos, I get it. Trust me. I'm not trying to make this sound like it's perfect and nothing is bad. This is a bad thing. This is a correcting thing. Here's the difference, though, right? Because they're being so preemptive, because they're getting out in front of this, this becomes just like it was after September the 11th, just like it was after the big crash, where people genuinely, instead of buying stuff from a third party that's in a different state, they want to spend money locally because their neighbors are hurting, right? And I personally, I hope I'm not being overly optimistic here, but I genuinely think that our small businesses will weather this storm, and people who may be laid off or have less hours will have opportunities elsewhere as we rally together because of a function of cheap financial policy and, doggone it, demand to help our neighbors.
Beautifully put, man.
I believe in it.
Yeah. I think we had a question really quickly here, and you know, I think we should address something. So John Abradovich is watching, and he's mentioning.
Hey, John.
Yeah, so he's mentioned things like the Fed's cut the Fed fund rate, not interest rates. It's too early to tell an interpretation simply because you know, this just got announced. Any response to that?
He's 100% right? So they could cut the overnight funds rate, the Fed fund rate, and the banks do nothing with that, right? They have to price that into it. Now, I'm basing my assessment on what they've done historically, but John's 100% correct. And by the way, I'm so glad you're watching this, John. I want to, Dan, can we do another one of these and have John on it? Like at some point this week?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So he's right. He's 100% right. It has to get priced in. Here's what I think is going to happen. There's going to be so much demand for, hey, well, they did this and we're not seeing the result of it. I think politically they're going to be forced to do something, even if it's just on the surface, to appear, hey, we're taking advantage of this. Now, again, I'd mentioned earlier that we don't want to have the perception that they're, I mean, personally, I think that something needs to be done directly for Main Street. It is never in our best interest when Wall Street gets one set of treatment and Main Street gets another set of treatment, right? So I'm hoping that with this overall fiduciary overarching policy, that there is a lot more in the way to help Main Street and the individual citizens of the country, right? It's just important, it's necessary.
Yep, I think that, that was something that we were talking or texting about earlier, is that hopefully there's some sort of stimulus package, or I mean, Main Street's going to get impacted, right? And there isn't enough really being done there almost.
Well, and you have to be really careful too. I want to say that I'm politically agnostic, so I'm not making a political statement by making this statement. I think of politics, poly from the Latin meaning many, and ticks meaning blood-sucking insects, if that gives you any idea as to where I stand with all of this. I don't want to make this sound political, but we have to be really cautious too because of the environment that we're in, right? So if we start helping individuals, we don't want anybody hijacking that message and saying, oh, that's socialism, what have you, right? Like, so we have to be very, 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 very cautious with, I want to make that clear. I am not suggesting a socialistic takeover. I'm just saying I would like to see some policy, maybe through tax reform of some kind. But here's the issue. Here's my problem when we say, oh, we're going to reduce payroll tax. Well, if you've been laid off, you don't have any payroll to get taxed anyway, so it doesn't matter if you keep more of it, right? So I don't have the answer. I'm hoping that some much, much smarter minds do, because I would really like to see, something done directly for Main Street.
Beautiful. Let's answer one more question here. Justin Myers was watching, and or maybe he still is. What's up, Justin? If you are, he's asking.
Hey, Justin.
Yeah. So he's asking, what effect will the closures in the hospitality sector potentially have? Job uncertainty is a factor that I can anticipate having a tangible effect on our markets. Florida is obviously a big tourism market, and I have seen layoffs already in Knoxville and hotel sector.
Yeah. So that's a big one. That's a really big one, right? So. I think the jury is out, but again, I love the concept of historical data, right? I was reading this morning just to kind of be up to speed on what's happening with our industry in terms of how real estate was handled when there were mass closures like this after September the 11th. A fascinating thing happened. You had a curve for about 4.5 months where you had layoff, and then the market did this and they couldn't hire people fast enough. So, and that's the airlines, which is directly related to the hospitality industry, which is directly related to the F&B industry, which is directly related to the insurance industry, which is directly related to real estate, right? They're all interwoven, right? So I think short term, you're going to see people in those positions, first in, last out, sort of with their jobs and who they're furloughing. But remember that we're at historical lows for unemployment right now. Right around the nation. I forget what the guys from Applied Analysis said. Jeremy Aguero, I don't know if he's watching or not, but I think they'd said that there was 3 jobs available for every one person that wanted one in Nevada, and we'll get back there. Right? I think this is just a short-term hiccup and a blip.
Beautiful. Michael England is wondering when you're going to honor that steak dinner. It'll have to be at his house because the restaurants are shutting down. Oh boy. Listen, man, thank you for bringing this up. I think, if I may, to John Abradovich's point, yes, it's too soon, which is why we needed to have this conversation, right? Because a lot of people are going to jump to assumptions. They're going to misinterpret things or create an interpretation. And for us, I think the key for this conversation was that, yes, it's too early to have any interpretation. Nonetheless, the conversation actually pushes those kind of things aside, noise like that, and it brings it back to those 2 questions that you asked. Why are you doing this, and how long do you plan on being in your next home?
Well, and also people need to take a breath. I think at this point, anybody who's speculating, first of all, everybody who has speculated has been wrong every time, right? They've been wrong every single time when it was specific to this incident, right? And that's why apologies in advance to any economists that are watching right now, but I wish I could have an economist job where I got to be right after it had happened, right? So they predict, oh, a recession is coming in 2025, right? And then it doesn't happen. Well, we saw it happen in 2021, right? So it's best not to speculate. It's best to just take a breath. There is a lot going on right now, right? There is a ton going on right now. And I would say that if you are a consumer, whatever decision you are making, now is the best time to hire a professional in the field to guide you through the decision you're making. Because ultimately it costs you nothing and you get the expertise of a professional, whatever that is, right? Whether that's real estate, whether that's insurance, whether that's mortgage, consult a professional now more than ever, especially one with experience and a good track record. I'm not suggesting people who are brand new to those industries aren't any good, but make sure that the new people, if that's who you're going to hire, are affiliated with a firm that has the power to show you the historical data. That's number one for the consumer. For the practitioners in our industry, now's the perfect time for you to get in front of the people that you care about. Because look, I don't know about you, and I may sound sappy saying this, if you're in my circle, I care about you and I want you to make good decisions, right? That's all I care about. I want you to make good decisions because if I help you do that, the money will come, right? The money will come. And remember this, opportunity is in these environments. While people are freaking out and jumping out of windows and losing their minds over toilet paper and all that stuff, I'm looking for the opportunity in it. And trust me, there's a ton of it hiding in plain sight. We just have to look for it.
Exactly. Yep. Buck, thank you so much, man. I feel like we need to do this more often.
I would love that, Dad. I love hanging out with you, even if it is digitally.
Exactly. We might have to do that more often.
I was gonna say we might be stuck doing this for a while.
Exactly. All right, Buck. Well, listen, thank you so much. Just in summary, we talked about what does the news about the Fed mean today, and we talked about quantitative easing, which I could see John Abradovich is going nuts in the comment section talking about. So thank you, John, for shedding some light there as well. We talked about this whole oil war, and of course, bringing it back to the fact that take a breath. Everything's going to be okay. It might seem challenging. It might seem weird, awkward, funny, scary, especially when you start tossing around analogies like 2008, 9/11, right? That's almost bringing up PTSD for some individuals. Just know that we're going to get through this. We're going to get through this together, and just find someone you trust to work with you along this way.
Yeah, it'll be all right in the end. And if it's not all right, it's not the end. I mean, I hate to simplify it that way, but it will be all right in the end. Surround yourself with the individuals that you trust most that have the experience. And if they don't have the experience, have them get somebody who has the experience. We're in this together. We're going to come out of this stronger. And I promise you, as bad as it seems right now, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Right, because I'm a 5-time end of the world champ. I've been involved I've been alive for, oh my God, it's the end of the world 5 times. And much to the chagrin of many people, I'm still here telling awful jokes.
Yep. Telling awful jokes indeed. Dad jokes. I got to learn from you, by the way, man. My 3-month-old is looking for them. Awesome, Buck. Buck Hujabre, thank you so much for today, man. I appreciate you. We'll definitely continue having more conversations. I assume that we'll probably see something else pop up in the news, which will lead to you and I getting on another stream. So again, thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to have this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for watching, gang. Call me with any questions, okay?
Awesome, man. Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.